We've got a real treat for our last session, which is Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, to have this kind of wide-ranging discussion with me. Mark, please join us on stage. Have a seat. So I think Lord Mark Malloch-Brown is well known to this audience, but I will just say a word or two about you. In fact, I have special feelings because when we first started Devex and nobody paid much attention to us as a student project, Mark was one of the few leaders in the development sector who said, I want to know more about this, and called us in when you were administrator of UNDP. Yeah. Mark had been at the World Bank. He started his career as a journalist, ended up working with Kofi Annan as Deputy Secretary General. You've just come here from Westminster. You're very involved in the politics of this country. We have successfully avoided the B word today, I think. But maybe we'll get into it a little bit now. Yeah, Mark, I wanted to get your big picture sense about where we stand. We're talking, of course, of really big issues, the climate that's changing, massive migration flows, global poverty, even in a world of such abundance. And we're talking about that at a time when there are people in the streets, when this country is facing a major deadline and decision. How do you see this at a big picture level?
Well, at a very, very, very meta level, you know, I was lucky enough to be active as an executive in international development at a time that we were coming off 30 years of more improvements in life, welfare, quality of living for people across the world than at any time in human history. And, you know, some of that momentum continues in terms of, you know, the changes, particularly in a region like Asia, but Africa as well. But it is now a very different dynamic. It is a dynamic where unaddressed global issues are catching up with us. The climate change thing, particularly, but you know, issues around demography and migration as well. Issues around just the massive gap in sufficient spending on infrastructure to kit out a world for the kind of size population we're going to be in mid-century. And where we do have the infrastructure, it's in the wrong places. People are in one part of the world, or growing populations are in one part of the world, the infrastructure is elsewhere. So, you know, and I say that because I think you've got to take that step back frame, as you kindly allowed me to describe, to then say, to sort of rate how we're doing. And, you know, obviously in a day like today, you can see that the private sector is in many ways incrementally and sometimes a bit more rapidly stepping up to the plate with more innovative financing solutions. But the problem is when it looks over its shoulder, government ain't there with it. So we're at a point where a new gap is growing up, where, you know, parts of the business community, both financial sector, but also companies in goods and services, you know, are really sort of understanding that they've got to operate beyond just the interests of shareholders and are, you know, really beginning to think again about what the corporation is in the 21st century. Is it a social agent as well as an instrument of return to investors? But, you know, government isn't there with them. We have arguably the most disappointing set of governments globally that we have had in a very long time. And of course, that isn't just a coincidence of elections. It's a world or a electorate deeply frustrated by the failure of the last generation of governments to address growing problems of inequality and exclusion and marginalization of people who found their sort of safe industrial wages being undermined by global changes. And, you know, while there is some comfort that this new generation of governments from America to here, but many other parts of the world as well, obviously, because I think it's a global majority of citizens who now live under such regimes. You know, these governments are not going to provide the solutions because they're not interested in the issues like climate change, like, say, universal basic income, like smart policies to deal with migration around the world. That sort of agenda is just too pink, too left, too statist for them.
So where do you think these solutions will come from? You just chaired the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. It was a 2-year commission with many of the largest corporations in the world. You came out with this well-known report now saying that there's a $12 trillion opportunity You've just talked about corporations maybe being partly on the right side of this, but if you look globally, the trust in corporations is also very low. What is this? Where will the solutions come from?
Well, I don't think it'll come from the corporates alone, but the corporates, when they put pressure on governments, can be instrumental. I mean, a lot of the corporations which are in my commission, their CEOs felt that they had a significant role, for example, in securing the Paris Climate Change Agreement. They claim that what happened between Copenhagen and Paris in terms of climate was that corporates engaged and the politicians were forced to see it wasn't just, a civil society movement that they could shrug off, that major business economic interests were now aligned behind it. And I think probably true, but since Paris, we've seen that, corporate pressure easily diffuses. American corporates are much less on their front foot than European corporates on this. That it's not easy. And, if the politicians fall back, then that corporate energy can easily stall. So, I think we've got to wait for that political pendulum in some ways to come back, to allow a more progressive set of solutions to emerge at the national political level. But we can't give up in the meantime because there's a clock ticking. These problems get worse every year they're unaddressed. So I think, through innovative finance, through corporate engagement, through civil society engagement, we have to go on pushing these rocks up the hill while acknowledging that the principal partner who should be there with us with their shoulder to the rock, government, is missing.
Do you think the SDGs are a help or a hindrance in this? The SDGs been around a few years now, and in the corporate world, widely embraced, maybe still not that well known in the public. We've got, certainly in my home country, in the US, not a lot of love for the SDGs. How do you look at them, and what do we do to use them in a more productive way?
Well, I think the SDGs were very much of their time, a sort of progressive, sort of center-right set of governments who felt that the market had been insufficiently engaged in the original MDGs, which, I had been lucky enough to be one of the architects of the MDGs, which were much more of a welfare net, reflecting very much the tenor of politics in 2000, Clinton, Blair, etc. The SDGs were a more imaginative inclusion of the private sector, perhaps complicated and overambitious in number, but I think represented a broader coalition. The problem is the politics has moved away from them since. Does that mean we should give up on them? I don't think so, because what I see is that within the corporate boardroom, they are a powerful organizing tool for thinking about what a company's contribution is. And in the development debate of governments, which has not gone away, it's just not moving forward with sufficient ambition, it is again a very important tool for framing discussions about priorities and trade-offs. So I think it'd be a huge loss to retreat from the SDGs. But I recognize that there are a set of goals who kind of look less timely today than they did a couple of years ago when they were adopted. And that's a comment on the times, not them.
It's very hard to predict politics in this country, what will happen, but you were a minister in the Foreign Office. You follow these things very closely and play a big role. I just wonder what your thoughts are about the future of the UK's role as a leader in aid, in development finance. We have the CDC's CEO here earlier. How do you see it playing out here in the UK?
Well, I hope okay. There's a lot of wood to touch. I mean, because, assuming that, if we take perhaps the more likely outcome that the country does leave the EU, I'm still resisting that, but occasionally I feel I'm sort of slightly in the last trench and looking to see how much gunpowder I've got left. But if we do leave, obviously there's been a lot of talk about global Britain. In truth, the electoral constituency behind leaving, a very large portion of it is nationalist anti-development assistance, anti-immigrant, the lot. So it's not going to be the most congenial base to run a progressive development policy from and to keep the 0.7 funding level at DFID. But the counter-argument is that, you know, this will be a Britain desperately looking for differentiating things to promote itself internationally. And being a 0.7 country is one of those things when you link it to our history and engagement in development over a long period of time. So my guess is people like the Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson, would wish to stick to the 0.7. It may become a less pure 0.7. It may become more trade promotion linked, and, you know, more military spending on peace missions will be kind of gouged out of the number. But they will want to continue to keep British development as a kind of example of British soft power. But as I say, I'm not sure their public opinion, will be with them on that. So we'll have to see. It'll be quite a tussle, I think.
This is where these very technocratic issues actually matter a lot. We've at Devex have been covering the OECD DAC, which is not an institution widely known, even in development circles, but makes the rules about what counts as aid and what doesn't. And these kinds of things will matter a lot as we move into a new era here in the UK.
It absolutely will, and you know, and I like you know, I think those DAC rules have been a critical line of resistance to, if you like, the sort of commercialization of aid in a way, and you know, Britain's travelled quite a journey because, you know, when I was first sort of very engaged with British development, actually covering it as a journalist. You know, it was a time when there was a massive scandal over a dam in Malaysia, you know, that had received British aid and which proved to be the worst kind of example of tied aid to British construction and contractors. So when then a Labour government came into power, you know, it was, you know, it had a wonderful base on which to kind of de-link our aid from our trade. And that was something that then became a cross-party priority. And I fear, you know, in this new political environment, that's going to fray quickly. And, you know, governments don't have long memories. And in that sense, I suspect this whole Malaysian scandal isn't remembered by anybody sitting around today's cabinet table or in the ministerial team at DFID.
And that trend, as you said earlier, is one of these trends that's global in nature, right? There are many countries around the world, major donors, that are increasingly using their aid budget to be more of a tool for trade, to serve commercial interests, maybe increasingly security interests. So just as we wrap up, you know, there's a lot of worrying clouds on the horizon. We haven't even talked about recession looming. But what do you think is your call to people who are involved in the finance part of this? People at the DFIs, at the impact investors, people that you work with in your commission. How do we sort of get through this challenging moment we're in, given the importance of achieving these SDGs?
Well, look, I think, and you're right to say recession, because I think, you know, the global economy is overdue, you know, quite a significant setback, and investment in developing markets, emerging markets, is always an early casualty of that as money races back to its home base. But I think my message to an audience like this is a very clear one, which is, you know, stick to your plan, because, you know, what I felt when I headed UNDP and subsequently in all the work I've done around private finance for development is you can't get away from the demographic reality, which is over the next 30, 40 years, all the growth, not just of people, but of disposable income, is going to be in developing countries. And the greatest gap in terms of what those people have versus what they need in terms of a workable infrastructure, the goods and services to improve their lives, is similarly going to be in those countries. So for anybody running a pension fund or any fund that has a relatively long horizon, there simply is no doubt that where the growth is going to come is in those markets. I mean, here in the UK, we tear ourselves apart about whether to build a new rail line to Manchester to cut 20 minutes off the train time. Those rail lines now snaking out across Africa or parts of Asia as you move from low to high speed rail in the Asian case, are having a dramatic economic return. And as your innovation starts to make financial return match economic return, there is no doubt where the lucky pensioner should want to have their funds invested. It's in funds in those markets, not those in the mature, aging market where the pensioner lives.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I appreciate that comment. I think there are many people in the room who might want to join you in that last trench that you find yourself in, and certainly would align themselves to this idea that this is the most important part of the world we could be investing in. So please join me in thanking Lord Mark Malloch-Brown for all you do and for those comments.
Thank you.